Hi, I'm Mark Honeybone from Property Ventures, and welcome to our weekly podcast where we interview prominent members of the investment community along with other professionals in the New Zealand property market. This is a free service from Property Ventures so that you can keep current and learn from some of the best around New Zealand. To check us out, take a look at propertyventures.co.nz. We hope you enjoy today's podcast. Hi and welcome to this week's podcast. I went to our local Property Investor Association meeting last week, and the speaker was someone that I wish I knew about 10 years ago. She is Rosemary Killip from Building Networks in Wellington, and she knows everything there is to about consents and what you do and don't need to do when doing a renovation or build. She teaches all sorts of people in the industry, including council staff and investors, to name just a few. I'm sure you'll get a lot out of these next two podcasts. Good evening and welcome to the show, Rosie.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great work. So just so listeners know who you are, tell us who is Rosie Killip and a bit about your background and what you do now.
Well, I am a learning and development consultant, and I've specialised all these years in building law. So I am an expert in building law compliance. I've been a homeowner, a landlord, a tenant, all the different spectrum of things. And so for the last 22 years, I've specialised in this particular part of training. Met lots of people in the building industry. I run my own training business where I run online and live workshops and help people with advice around these gnarly little things they get when they come across building compliance.
Great stuff, and it's such an important topic, and it's really actually interesting getting you along tonight. And I listened to you last week at the local Property Investor Association, and there's not many people out there doing what you do, I guess.
That's right. It's a funny little situation. I must say, back in 1992, when I came across and started to specialise in this bit of legislation, I was already a landlord, and I really wish I had somebody like me giving me the advice that I now know, because I certainly made my own share of mistakes for sure. I also owned my own home, and again I made my own fair share of mistakes. And when I came across the law and got to know people within the building industry, I found out a lot of myths and legends that got debunked. And so I hope tonight for your listeners to do that very thing for them.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. And it's in everyday life of an investor, some of the questions that come up, and I mean, again, last week and tonight will probably be great for the listeners to listen to, like I enjoyed last Wednesday night. But we had a property just recently that had it was a 3-bedroom and a 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom, and the 3-bedroom was the only one consented. But it was, the buyers want to know, what now? What do we do? Where do we go? Who can we ask even? I hadn't met you at that stage, so we didn't go and see Rosie Killip. But so we will get more into that later on anyway, I guess. But so people that are listening here from all over the country and overseas, a lot of councils in New Zealand. In fact, you'll tell us how many probably, but are all councils the same as far as working with them?
Very good question. $1 million question. There are 64. Right, 64 different, what we call building consent authorities or local councils who deal with Building Act stuff. Of course, there are other bits of law that I don't teach but are related, like resource management, HASNO, health and safety, other things that people may be aware of. But in terms of the Building Act, if you want to build a new building or inquire about property that you may wish to buy, there are 64 different doors to knock on, and they are very different beasts. Whether you're in North Island, down to the Bluff, and anywhere in between, they really are differently resourced. There are different people. They are a local body, so they're not a private organisation. Look, some of these people are private investors themselves. They've bought property, they know the stuff. And of course, most of them are homeowners. So, you are dealing with a person more than anything else. They might be a regulator and an enforcer, but you're dealing with a person who values property, just like most of your listeners do. And so my first tip of the night would be to say, if you're dealing with a local authority, remember they're a person first. They live in a home. They could well have rental properties themselves, and therefore they understand some of the challenges you face. What they would say, if they were on the end of this call, would be it would be so good if people would ask first and buy later. What often happens is people buy on a whim. They think they've done due diligence by doing some legal process, but in fact they have not done a good compliance check nor a good physical check, so they don't really know what they're buying. And at the end of the day, we all make decisions on risk. You know, we make a risk to get out of bed every morning, drive a car, walk down the street. So if we want to buy a dwelling or a commercial property, we are buying some degree of risk which we may be able to tolerate. My point is, and councils would agree, that if you don't understand the risk, then you shouldn't be buying.
Absolutely, and that's a part of all the reports and part of the DD, what you should be doing, especially with some types of properties. Some are more straightforward than others, I guess.
That's right. And what also occurs to me from our international market is, in the main, New Zealand compared to other countries, we've got a lot of old building stock. So you are buying an older property. You know, typically in our dwellings, they're not well insulated from the past. They are now, but not back in the 70s, 60s, and further back in time. They may be damp. They may have some wonderful large section space which someone decides to subdivide, and there are rules around that. Often the things that people want to buy, like a home and income situation, really needs a little bit more investigation. You know, is the other building on that property consented, or has someone whipped that up on a whim without going through the right protocols? And look, at the end of the day, you may still buy it, right? This is a negotiation point in the pricing. You may still buy it and decide to redeem that situation. But the point is, at least you know, if you're right up to the hilt in terms of your borrowings, buying something like that could sink you well under and not get any return that you were expecting.
Yeah, that's great, and a lot of our people, obviously, who are listening to this, they are after the home and income as the priority of the priority sort of property they're trying to find. And I've just noticed myself in the last probably 12 months a real change there, where investors aren't buying the home and or not home and incomes because they're not consented, but there's 2 or 3 incomes when they aren't consented, where a year or two ago people didn't seem to mind quite so much. So people are wising up and probably getting a little bit running scared from the council and what can happen. I suppose insurance and stuff's covered also with that, or has an effect on that.
Look, I think that's right, Mark. I think insurance is a bigger question, and it would be very interesting to kind of get their viewpoint. What I understand, where there is building failure or an incident, that insurers will look at any way to not pay out. And so if you have inherited a situation which was unconsented, let's make sure that there's a couple of things true. One, did that work need consent in the first place? You know, there's a lot of work from the 80s, 70s, 60s and backwards that never needed a consent because we lived in the world of permits. So don't sweat it. You know, if you've got an old building and you look up a council file and think, oh my goodness, there's no consent here, don't sweat it. If it was an old permitted situation, that's allowed to be so. There was never the rules of the day that we have now back then. However, if you've had something through the 90s or this early millennia, which should have had a consent and does not, now we've got a little bit more work to do. But once again, it can be redeemed in some way. I mean, the worst case scenario is get a consent to demolish it and start all over again. You know, that could be a factor you could play into the cards. And you're right, people do seem to be more rigorous, but sometimes they go to the other extent of being quite ridiculous. I've dealt with situations where people have been going, oh my goodness, this dwelling's got asbestos. Well, hello, every building in the street from the 70s has got asbestos-backed lino, asbestos barge boards, maybe asbestos mixed cladding of some sort. And every house on the street's like that. So you get what you get. If you leave it, and don't muck around with it, you keep it in its integrity, things might be fine. But the scaremongering around, oh my goodness, this has got some danger, is actually, in some cases, unwarranted. And you get what you get. Some of these dwellings have served well as being dwellings and investments for people for eons and will continue to do so. And at some point, one day, yes, somebody might decide to buy that property, bowl down what's there and rebuild something brand new. That's great. That's the whole evolution of building.
Yeah, in fact, that's a great point you just brought up before, and I do see people, investors now, I think they are getting scared from just maybe a mate or a friend that maybe doesn't know the market or the ins and outs of building as well as they should, and they're actually letting good investments go by because just from what other people were saying, and as you said, consents. Sorry, it wasn't called consents before 1992. It was a permit. A permit, yeah, the permits, mm-hmm. And you don't need to do. We didn't need to do then what you do now, and there's actually, as long as you've got some sort of record of it, or sometimes you even don't have a record of it. As long as pre-1992, it doesn't have that much of an effect. So I do see people walking away from very good deals sometimes because of that.
Look, I'll give you a really good example. State housing back in the day, built in the 60s, rock solid brick stuff or timber weatherboard stuff. Yeah, they were cold. They weren't insulated to the degree we'd have now. They don't have double glazing. Often they had brick chimneys, old fireplaces. They had kitchens and bedrooms, pokey rooms, no open plan. But you look at that sort of situation and say, oh my goodness, there's no consent. In fact, a lot of them have no record whatsoever of even existing on a dwelling, although you're paying rates for it.
Yeah.
Well,
the rates is a giveaway.
Back in the day, maybe someone's lost the files or they've gone in the ether. At the end of the day, that house is a classic example of perhaps being a really nice, tidy little investment for someone to improve upon all those modern things we might like to do to it, and yet it has no record of its existence. Don't sweat it. You can always redeem it by putting an as-built floor plan in file with council, and any new work you want to do, you start again. You draw the drawings, get the architect or draftee to get those plans drawn up. You do the work you want to do that is legit consent, and now we start afresh with a new floor plan, a site plan. We know what's there. We then do the work that we want to do, which is now recorded, consented, and code compliant. We're good. We're good.
Yeah, we'll go on and talk about what a code of acceptance is later on. At our previous house where I live in here was a 1930s villa, beautiful place, and there was nothing on the file at all. There was no record, so but it still existed, and it once would have been given a permit to be built, no doubt.
That's right.
Never any issue with it, so.
That's right. And look, in that situation, again, I say don't sweat it. We, if we did choose to do work to it, yes, we would have to backfill some data because there's not a lot of stuff on file. And it's common, right? It is common. As I say, we have old building stock, often not recorded that well. Councils merged. Would you believe, Mark, we had 122 councils at one time. In the late 80s, there were 122 borough, city or district councils for a country which had about 3 million people. So we've cut back now to 64, which means a whole lot of councils merged their filing systems and some of the stuff got lost.
Yep. Hey, to tell me, actually, just while we're talking about councils, I know I reckon the Marlborough District Council has got one of the best in New Zealand as far as you can go online and see your whole property file, everything's there. Others aren't around the country. Is that going to change in other or are you aware of that's going to change in other councils around the country? Or
Look, certainly as each council faces the digitisation of data question and the demand from the sector, it's got to be funded from somewhere. So some councils are fortunate, and it's an absolute blessing when they can scan and digitise all the information for you to access at whatever time of day, wherever you are in the world. That's fantastic. However, there's a substantial part of data which is microfiche still. There are old record books going back to antiquity when our little towns or cities were founded. And so there is still good reason to look beyond the digitised data. Be careful. You know, if you get a land information memorandum, a LIM, it makes someone research. So at the council, someone behind the scene is not just putting a piece of paper together, they're researching what the council knows. And sometimes they're going through archive books, microfiche, goodness knows what, to give you the right information to make your right investment decisions. So look, all councils are different. Some are wealthy, some are not. Some have digitised some data. Very few have digitised everything. So if you do find a council with that, go well, but also be smart. Is there anything else I should refer to? Is there anything else I need to know? Is there any other division of council that has some requirement over my property? Is there any other network utility operator like electricity, gas, telecommunications or otherwise I need to consult with? Is my building ancient enough to be historically listed, and therefore I need to talk to the Historic Places Trust? There's a number of questions that need to be answered in that space, because what you don't want is any surprises. If you're going to buy and invest in property, you want to know what you've got without any surprises, I would think.
Yeah. I'll just go back to one more question with the councils before we sort of move on, and it may appear a simple question. I don't know how involved you want to get with it, but start off. Why do councils have consents?
You know what? I think it boils down to something really simple. The government made the Building Act, not councils. So our national government decided, since the eons of time when we had whare fires, the Napier earthquake, state housing all the way through, that people doing their own DIY stuff had a limitation, that the building industry couldn't be trusted to do it for themselves anyway. And so the rules are there to protect the public, because we can't be trusted to look after ourselves by ourselves, and the building industry can't be trusted to do it by itself either. So the rules exist as consents. So some third eye, being the local government body in your district, has a chance to take a non-vested interest, a public service interest, but they don't own it, they're not building it. Yes, they get fees for their inspections, but they're not vested interested in the outcome. Therefore, from a public good and enduring perspective, their customer is not you, the ratepayer, nor you, the building owner. The customer is the building, because someone other than you will buy this. Someone in another decade or more will buy it again, maybe, sell it, renovate it, do things to it. So the consent process is a control mechanism.
Absolutely, we've seen a lot of things go wrong in the last 20 years, leaky buildings and what have you, just to show how necessary it is through the whole process. And as you said, it's a time thing. People buy, sell, they want to see what happened 10, 15, 20 years ago, and they'll be able to do that in 20 or 30 years' time when we've had good records since 1992. So.
That's right, and look, I think our record keeping has got much better, particularly since 2005. We've had the Building Act around since 1991, and there was a renovation of that Act in 2004, and stuff kicks in usually about a year later. So 2005, you start to see files which are much padded out than files, say, from the 90s. So you get a 3-bedroom, single-story dwelling, and you look at the files now versus what they got, say, in 2004 versus what was happening in 1994. They are very different filing systems. And the idea is we've got a better idea around what is being built to plan rather than someone guessing.
Right. No, that's good. Hey, one thing I really enjoyed last week, and I think a lot of people who listened to you got out of it, is people may be surprised on what they don't need a building consent for. Can you touch on some of the most unusual, surprising, some things that listeners may not be aware of within a renovation or what have you that you don't need consent for that most people think they do?
Very good point. Most people think a building consent is a pain. It takes time, it's costly, and so on. So what I'm about to tell you, yes, is a list of things that you can do without a consent. However, my rider is this. Be ready for 2 things. Be ready that no one else is inspecting or verifying or checking or signing off the work complies with anything. And if you're prepared to tolerate that and you think you've got a good builder or you are a good builder, go for your life.
Right.
However, down the track, there will be no record on your property file of what you're doing ever occurring. So some green investor or wannabe homeowner in the future may pull out this property file and go, oh my goodness, it does not look like the plan. Well, that's true, because a bank of this work we can do and get on with it and get on with life without a consent. Here's a suggestion. If you do some of this work without a consent, you keep your own records. Keep a little folder, throw stuff in there of documenting this stuff that you're going to do without a consent. So in the future, when and if you sell, you've got a nice little folder that says, look, here's a folder of all the work I've done without a consent. Council has a record of the stuff that did have consent and has been signed off, but here's the work legit that didn't need it. And it gives them at least some comfort level rather than freaking out that, oh my goodness, your house doesn't look like the plan on council file. So let's think about what people like to do with renovations. If I take my old example of the state house, well, one of the first things you want to do is make it warmer. So you're going to want to insulate it. Now, you can go forth and insulate, get any subsidies that may be available in the ceiling space and underfloor without a consent. Go for your life. You cannot do the external walls, or what effectively means the internal wall facing its way outside. You just can't do it. They want to have a consent. They want to look and make sure you're not going to bother up the structural supports of that dwelling. Another thing you'll probably do these days is make a call on whether you want to do a wood burner or a heat pump. And I know heat pumps have become very popular for their efficiency and lack of mucking around, as it were. So if you install a heat pump, you'll need an electrician to wire it up for you. You do not need a building consent. However, if you want a wood burner, you will need a building consent. Even more so, if that same wood burner is a wetback through to your hot water supply, you again will need a consent. If you do solar water heating, it will need a consent. But let's think of some other things you might want to do in this house. Maybe we want to make it more open plan. A lot of the walls we're dealing with are internal walls without studs or supports holding up any structural element. You may need a little bit of advice from a good builder to say which walls are what so that you know for sure, because the last thing you want is the roof caving in on you.
Yep.
So, if you find, hey, these walls are non-structural, you can remove them and go for your life and open plan this dwelling. You may want some new kitchen cabinets and a new bench top. Again, those things don't need a building consent. Where it would kick in is when you start mucking around with your hot and cold water supply, or let's say you wanted to put the kitchen, say, where the lounge was, and there was no hot and cold water running there, no waste situation. That would need a consent because you're dealing with pipework that was never there before. But just taking out old, manky looking kitchen cabinets and cupboards and replacing them with cool looking modernised joinery, that's all good. You go for your life without a consent. The other thing people do is they tend to look for decking. So if you're doing a deck that's no more than 1.5 metres off the ground, again, you can go for your life. It can be as large as you like, as long as you're not overhanging the road or any other neighbouring property, and you can build that without a consent. Again, some of the things that people sometimes look at is, should I replace my windows? You know, maybe they're old window joinery and single glazed and not double glazed. Sometimes the jury gets out on this one, but the Building Act talks about replacing a comparable product in the same position. So if you go to a window supplier and say, hey, look, I've got this kind of window and I want to put this one back in, or what can I put in there that's comparable? Then you again can go through without a building consent, because you're basically not enlarging the space or the window frame or the hole where the window frame and window glazing sits. You're just modernising it. So that's a really good thing that a lot of those nice little investment tickle-ups can go without a consent. Yeah. The last one people tend to do is bathrooms. They tend to modernise bathrooms. So let's say you want to rip out an old vanity, bathtub, a shower box and put in an acrylic shower and different fixtures in that bathroom. Again, you can do that. You could mix them around in that same situation by putting, say, the shower where the bath is and vice versa. So you can do those things again without a consent, because you're basically doing a low-risk moving around situation rather than building, say, an ensuite bathroom as new, which is a completely different consenting item.
Right. Great. Yes, it basically comes down to mainly anything structurally, obviously, and anything to do with water, basically, isn't it? Almost.
That's right. That's right.
And it's obvious, they can cause water issues or weather tightness issues. I assume the bats and the walls are again for the sweating situation to make sure it's the right distance away from the exterior, I guess, and those sorts of issues.
And I think, again, you're right. It's about the build-up of internal moisture, the external moisture. We've had a fair enough of that, I must say, this season.
Yeah.
With, what's happening to our roof and our cladding. Again, when we look at, say, a re-roof situation, if we've got a really old dwelling and we're wanting to replace the roof, we're allowed to do such a thing. However, inevitably, when we unpack an old roof, we're going to find ugly underneath. And so that's where, foreseeing that ugly, a council usually says, you know what, it's in your best interest to get a consent so we can have a good look and see what you've got, because maybe there are some roof trusses and structural elements up there that need to be replaced now we've got that roof lining off.
Right. Okay, yeah, so very interesting. Of some things that perhaps listeners thought they did need consent for, they might not necessarily need them for. So where do they go to back them up? It's all nice saying, I didn't think I needed a consent. Well, where can they go apart from somewhere on your website to have a look to see what needs consented and what doesn't need consent?
Well, look, if you're really interested in finding the legal answer, you can download the Building Act. You can do it from the government website or from my website, buildingnetworks.co.nz, and go to Schedule 1. That's the list of exempt work. There's 42 items on that list, and one more, which is a special permission area of the law. There's a guidance book that goes with that. I've got that as a shortcut on my website and also on the government website, which is www.dbh.govt.nz. So very powerful, big website.
Yeah, wealth information on that site.
Yes, so if you have a look, most of you are probably used to looking at that for the tenancy tab. Look at the building tab and look for the publications and for, exemptions publication. It's a nice little document which you can read your way through. It's got some really good pictures in it to show you the ins and the outs to help justify what you thought might have needed a consent or not. Here's my warning though. A lot of people will consult their builder or plumber or other tradesperson about what does or does not need consent. And I would warn and caution people to say, you know what, without prejudice, it would be really good if you consulted the council as well. Because sometimes I've found in my experience, the tradies don't know any more than what the layperson might know about what needs consent or not. And unfortunately, years down the track, people get themselves all tangled up in knots saying, hey, I relied on my builder to tell me what needed consent or not, and now I find I should have taken one out, I didn't, and now I'm in trouble. Well, he's long gone, you've paid him the money, and it's worthwhile doing your homework. It costs you nothing to ring the council and say, hey, I've got a query, can you help me?
I hope you enjoyed the first part of this interview. If you have any topics or anyone you would like interviewed, please let us know by emailing us at info@propertyventures.co.nz or visiting our website. I hope you enjoyed and hope you have an outstanding week.